Welcome to the Non-Anxious Leader, Family Systems Basics. This is the first in a three-part presentation on understanding family process. And at the beginning of each presentation, I quote Soren Kierkegaard, who says, "Now, Lord, with your help, I shall become myself." Edwin Friedman, the author of Generation to Generation, I believe would agree with this, that this is the path to becoming a self-differentiated person and in turn a non-anxious leader. And his definition of leadership through self-differentiation is that we take responsibility for our own goals and our own well-being while staying in touch with the body in a way that encourages other people to follow. And even when there's resistance, that we stay connected, especially to the resistors. And that gives the body every opportunity to follow. Today we're going to cover three concepts in family process: emotional distance, loss and replacement, and chronic conditions. Emotional distance is is a slippery thing. There's kind of a symmetry in that when people are too close, there are problems, and when they are too distant, the same problems can result. And it's really important to understand that emotional distance is not the same thing as physical distance. In fact, in particular when people are too close, and people often try to deal with that by creating physical distance. When there are two partners and one of them is anxious about the other's goings on, the other may take up a hobby that takes them away from the home, and they're trying to create some physical distance, but that doesn't really create emotional distance. Or a child moves across country to try to create some emotional distance from the parent, but it really doesn't change things. It just causes those issues to resurface in other ways. The thing about emotional distance is we're able to create appropriate emotional distance when we have the capacity to define ourselves, as well as the ability to control our own reactive mechanisms. And when you think about what reactive mechanisms are, those are the automatic responses we have in relationships where we're too close, and typically when there's a lot of anxiety going on. And that's typically what happens there is that because we are not doing our own work and we're not able to self-define, we just respond in automatic ways. So if a partner speaks to us in a certain tone, we may have a certain automatic response, and we'll do the same dance every time. Instead, if we're able to define ourselves, if we're able to take our own position and our own stand, it starts to create space in a way that gives the relationship the ability to grow. And so the quickest way to destroy distance in a relationship, emotional distance, is to overfunction anxiously in another's space. And if we've ever had an issue with a child where, as a parent, where we're trying to get them to get something right, and we are not able to control our anxiety, and we're not able to keep from overfunctioning, you would probably recognize that scenario. And the typical response of the child is either to get defensive or to withdraw completely, and so to either come back with more anxiety or to just cut off completely. Distance is measured, emotional distance is measured in resiliency. So it's not that you're not close to somebody. It's when there's not an appropriate emotional distance, it just means you're either too close, meaning you're an anxious presence, or you're too far emotionally, meaning you're really a non-anxious non-presence, or as Friedman calls it, you're cut off. So proper emotional distance is measured in resiliency in that there's the ability to have different distances at different times. It's not about improving communications or helping people to show more feelings or having people get closer. It's about having this healthy relationship where sometimes people can be close and sometimes they don't really need to be connected, but it's because each person in the relationship is able to express their own needs and goals. They're able to be self-defined in a way that's healthy for both of them. The next concept is loss and replacement. And to the extent a family rushes to replace loss, its pain will be lessened, but so will the potential for change that the loss made possible. And when we talk about loss, we of course think about death, but really our life journey is filled with losses. Going from childhood to adulthood is a loss. If we actually go into a committed relationship, we lose our singleness, or then if that relationship breaks up, we lose that relationship as a couple. When we change jobs, that's a loss. When we get a promotion, that's a loss. When we get fired, that's a loss. And so on and on and on, our journey is filled with losses. And to the extent that we don't deal with those losses at the time, and instead try to replace them with something else, we are not giving ourselves an opportunity to grow. Really, replacement is a function of grief, which is a function of the unworked out residue in the relationship that was lost. So what happens is, when there's a loss, the system wants to replace it. It's a homeostatic principle. It wants to kind of get back to equilibrium. But if we're self-defined enough and able to allow ourselves to work through that loss, then there's the opportunity for ourselves and for the system to grow. A great example I can think of is early on in my pastoral ministry, I had a couple who split up after 6 months, and I started working with the woman in this couple, and it turned out that her mother was very, very, very close to the woman's grandfather, her mother's father, and that the woman who had just split up in the relationship was born about a month after her grandfather died. And so this was a clear situation of loss and replacement, where the woman's mother used her as a replacement for her own father, and not surprisingly functioned anxiously in this young woman's space all the way into her marriage. And so the young woman was coached to work out her relationship with her mother, and in so doing, she actually got to a healthy place. Didn't save the relationship, but it helped her prepare her for the next relationship. It's interesting, in Friedman's book on page 43, he has an example called Skin Deep, and he writes, a nurse who was dealing with various problems of loss, divorced from her husband, separating from her children, and changing her own family position as a replacement for her mother's mother, was helped through these dilemmas when she came across the following biological fact in a medical journal. When a wound occurs, there are two kinds of tissue that must heal: the connective tissue below the surface and the protective tissue of the skin. If the protective tissue heals too quickly, healing of the connective tissue will not be sound, causing other problems to surface later, or worse, never to surface at all. She was able to make the analogy that in some families, emotional wounds also close too quickly, and when they do, it is often very difficult to reopen them again, despite the promise of a more fundamental healing. So the point Friedman is making here is that our tendency in family systems is when there is a loss that we want to find replacement, because we don't really want to deal with the pain. We want to lessen the pain. But in reality, if we are willing to work through that loss, we actually find more healing and find that we grow in our capacity as self-differentiated persons. What's interesting about this idea of loss and replacement is that the residue from unworked out relationships that we bring into our current relationships will always affect our ability to function. So if we have had a loss and we've replaced it too soon, or we haven't worked it out in a way that's healthy, it's going to affect how we function in our current relationships. The positive side of that is it's never too late to work out a relationship. Even if somebody's already passed on or they're no longer in our lives, there are still ways to work through relationships. And then the final concept in this session is chronic conditions. And a chronic condition is something that that is perpetual or recurrent. And for it to be chronic, what Friedman helps us to understand is there must be some kind of feedback to sustain it, and the feedback can either be reactive or adaptive. And reactive feedback is typically responding to anxiety, with defensiveness, with conflict, with argument. And if you have a recurring argument with some relationship in your life, you probably know what that dance looks like. Somebody says something, there's a certain response, it escalates, and we replay that same script over and over again. That would be a chronic situation. Adaptive feedback is a little different in that one party, rather than being reactive, withdraws and allows the activity to continue without responding at all. And in either case, either reactive feedback or adaptive feedback is what allows a chronic problem in the family to be sustained. Friedman says that the chronic aspect of an identified patient has to do with the residue of those in relationship with her or him. And the chronic aspect of a symptom in a husband, wife, partner, or child has primarily to do with his or her own past. Has primarily to do not with his or her own past, but with the spouse's or parents' past. Not with his or her own childhood, but with the spouse's or parents' childhood. Otherwise, the problem would not have become chronic, nor perhaps even symptomatic to begin with. So an example here would be, let's say that a woman was required to care for her siblings at an early age. And because of that, she had to drop out of school and regrets not having an education. Now she overfunctions with her child's education, who, not surprisingly, hates school. The more help she tries to get, the worse it gets. So the residue is the woman's own feelings about her education, and then the feedback is, or then the way that unworked out residue surfaces is she overfunctions with her child, and the feedback is that the child responds by doing worse in school. It's really interesting because I was in a clergy group, and we were going through this concept, and a guy slaps himself on the forehead, and we're all going, "Why'd you do that, Randy?" And he goes, "Well, I hated math all my life, and my mom wanted me to be top-notch in math, and she was always in my face about it. And finally, at age 16, she gave up, and I became great in math." So it's a great example of how you have to have both the initial action, that is somebody who has anxiety or has an issue, and then you have to have the either reactive or adaptive feedback to sustain that. Now, if you're the recipient of the initial anxiety, the way you prevent having a reactive or adaptive feedback comes from being self-defined, being able to take your own position, make your own stand in a non-anxious way, not confronting, not running away, but saying, this is what I believe, this is who I am, And we'll talk about some strategies for how you do that in the next couple sessions. So those are the three that we're covering today. In the next session, we'll cover pain and responsibility, the paradox of seriousness and the playfulness of paradox, and then secrets and systems.